Hey everyone, I'm Paul Moore and this is Watchsquisite. By profession, I am an electrical and mechanical engineer specializing in forensic investigations. In really simple terms, I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out how and why things fail. But I'm also a complete watch nut. So with this channel, I'm basically bringing those two parts of my life together. We're going to talk about how watches are engineered, how they actually work in the real world, and just as importantly, why we enjoy these ridiculous little machines so much in the first place. And for this first comparison, I wanted to start with two watches that I genuinely wear and genuinely have a hard time choosing between. The Tudor Pelagos and the Marathon GSAR. And this isn't really going to be a traditional which watch is better comparison, because honestly, they're both really good watches. The question I want to answer is a little more personal. If I'm leaving tomorrow morning for an actual forensic assignment and I can only bring one of these two watches, which one am I going to take? So quite often in my work, I'll get sent somewhere to investigate a fire or a traffic accident. And that usually means a very early morning flight. So picture this. So it's still dark outside, my wife's asleep, I'm trying not to make any noise, and I keep a little flashlight next to the bed, so I'll grab the flashlight and I'll walk over to the dresser and shine it down into my watch box. And then I stand there and stare. Sometimes I'll actually hit the watches with the flashlight and charge up the Lume, and then I'll just stand there looking at all of them glowing in the dark. I know it's ridiculous. And every once in a while, I'll look back over my shoulder at my wife to make sure she isn't awake, because I can only imagine what this looks like. Like, what is this weirdo doing standing over a box of watches with a flashlight at 4:30 in the morning? But she's usually asleep. At least I think she's asleep. And then I start thinking about the trip I'm about to take. What am I actually going to be doing on that trip? Is this going to be a fire scene? And if it is it something relatively clean? Or am I going into a building that's basically burned to the ground? Am I going to be crawling around collapsed roofing, soot, charred structural members, debris, all that normal fun stuff at a fire scene? Or maybe it's an accident reconstruction. In that case, I might be inspecting a badly damaged vehicle or crawling underneath it. I could be looking at mechanical components, measuring damage. Or sometimes I'll be out alongside the roadway. Sometimes I'll be flying a drone over an accident site. It just varies depending on the accident. Of course, I don't know necessarily what the weather is going to do. So all of that is going through my head while I'm staring into my watch box. And some watches get eliminated pretty quickly. I'm probably not taking a dress watch into a burned out building. There's some chronographs I don't necessarily want to crawl underneath a wrecked car wearing. But invariably, these two watches end up near the top of the list. The Marathon GSAR and the Tudor Pelagos. And I think the reason is pretty simple. They both feel like legitimate tool watches. They're both extremely legible. They're both more water resistant than I will probably ever need, and neither one feels delicate. But they're very different. The Marathon feels like a tough piece of equipment. The Pelagos feels like a very refined piece of equipment, and that difference turns out to be pretty important. So when I look down at the Marathon, my first reaction is basically, man, this thing just looks tough. It looks like what I imagine when somebody says tool watch. The dial sits way down in the case. You've got the tritium tubes. You've got this big protected crown. Everything about it looks purposeful. There's not much here that feels decorative just for the sake of being decorative. And I love that. I can actually sit there and stare at this watch for a while, which again, probably says something slightly concerning about me. I even like the little radiation symbol on the dial. Not sure why, but I just like it. But the overriding feeling I get from the Marathon is that I could take this thing just about anywhere and ask it to do just about anything. It feels like equipment. And then there's the Pelagos. And I have to say my reaction is kind of different, because I look at this watch and I think this is just a beautiful watch. I don't really mean that in a dress watch sense, because it's still obviously, very obviously, a tool watch. But this blue on blue combination is absolutely fantastic. I've worn this watch in the Caribbean and I've looked down at it with the blue water in the background, and the color is remarkably close. There's something about that color that just works for me, and then you could pick it up, and because it's titanium, It's much lighter than you'd expect it to be. It has a strange combination of feeling very serious and very capable, but also very refined. Let's get the basic numbers out of the way. The Pelagos has a 42mm titanium case, approximately 14.3 millimeters thick and roughly 50 millimeters lug to lug with a 22mm lug width. It uses a unidirectional titanium bezel with a ceramic insert and carries 500 meters of water resistance. Inside is Tudor's cost-certified MT5612 automatic movement with approximately 70 hours of power reserve. The Marathon GSAR is 41 millimeters across, approximately 14 millimeters thick, and 48 millimeters lug to lug with a 20 millimeter lug width. Its case is 316L stainless steel with a unidirectional dive bezel and sapphire crystal and 300 meters of water resistance. Inside is a Sellita SW200-1 automatic movement with Inca block shock protection. So this is not the standard Marathon bracelet. This is an Islander H-Link bracelet made specifically for the 41mm GSAR and sold by Island Watch. And I have to give them a shout out here because this bracelet works amazingly well on the watch. The fit is excellent, it feels substantial enough to match the watch, and most importantly for me, the clasp has a 6-position toolless quick adjustment. So genuinely shout out to Island Watch because they made a really damn good bracelet for this GSAR. So let's make this practical. Let's say I get to the assignment and it's a nasty fire scene. Not a clean lab exam. I mean, there could be soot, debris, burned structural members, maybe I'm crawling around on the floor. It's that kind of job. So if you handed me both of these watches at the door and said, pick one, I think my first instinct is the Marathon. I'm saying instinct very deliberately because if I stop and think about it, the Pelagos is absolutely capable of doing the job. It's a 500-meter titanium dive watch, for goodness sake. It's not fragile. But psychologically, I look at the Marathon and like, dang, that's what this thing is built for. It feels like something I can bang around. It looks like something I can bang around. And to be honest, I don't really worry about hitting it on anything or scratching it up. I can just wash it off later. But maybe that's unfair to the Tudor. It probably is unfair, because the limitation here may not be the Pelagos. It might be me. The Tudor costs considerably more money, like more than twice as much. And whether we like admitting it or not, the price can change the way we treat something or even think about it. If these two watches cost exactly the same amount, would I still instinctively grab the Marathon? I'm not sure. And I think that's the interesting part. There's another difference here between these two watches that becomes much more obvious when we look at them the way I often look at evidence professionally. That's under the microscope. I put both watches under a microscope and examine the details that are difficult, if not sometimes impossible, to really evaluate with the naked eye. And this is one area where the Tudor's higher level of refinement becomes pretty obvious. Like looking closely at the lettering, on the Pelagos, the printing is noticeably cleaner and more precisely defined. The edges of the characters are sharper. The application is more consistent. And under magnification, the overall execution just simply looks more refined. Now compare that with the Marathon. And I want to be clear here, the GSAR is not poorly made, not at all. But under the microscope, its lettering and some of its finer finishings simply aren't executed to the same standard as the Tudor. I saw that same general difference in several other areas I examined. The Pelagos consistently shows more attention to those really small details. Under normal viewing, some of these differences are a little subtle, but under the microscope, they're not subtle at all. But here's the obvious question. Does any of this actually matter? And if I'm crawling underneath a wrecked vehicle, do I really care that the edge of a letter looks cleaner under a microscope? Of course not. And it certainly doesn't make the Marathon a worse tool watch. What I think it does is help explain the difference between these two watches. The Marathon is very focused on capability. The Tudor gives you the same capability, if not more, plus another level of refinement. And under normal conditions, you may only sort of sense that difference. Under magnification, you can actually see it. But does that justify the difference in price? That's actually a more complicated question, but at least we have some tangible things we can point to. Now let's change the situation. I've been at the scene for 8 hours. I'm filthy. I go back to the hotel, take a shower, put on a decent shirt, and somebody says, hey, let's go grab dinner and drinks. Can I wear the Marathon? Absolutely, and I would. but it still looks like the Marathon. It still has that very utilitarian, equipment-like personality. On the other hand, the Pelagos changes character a little more easily. It's still a tool watch, but cleaned up and on the wrist with a decent shirt. Let's not mince words. This thing looks freaking fantastic. And that matters to me on a work trip, because I'm not only choosing a watch for the 3 or 4 hours when I'm doing the dirtiest part of the assignment, I'm choosing a watch for the whole trip. And let's face it, we all want to feel really good about the watch that's sitting on our wrist. Which brings me back to these scratches on the watch. So I'm looking at this Pelagos, and it's got really big marks on the side of the case. And I know there are people watching right now that are probably thinking, how can you stand that? And I get it. The first serious scratch on an expensive watch can actually hurt. But here's where I've ended up. I don't want to intentionally abuse my watches. There's a difference between using something and being careless with it. But I also don't want a tool watch that I'm afraid to use. This Pelagos has been on trips, it's been on assignments, it's been in the Caribbean, it's been part of my life. And those scratches are part of that. At some point, the marks stop feeling like damage and they start feeling a little bit more like history. And I think that's one of the reasons watches are interesting in a way that a lot of other objects aren't. They travel with us. You can look down at a watch years later and remember where you were wearing it. A trip, a job, a vacation, something that happened in your life. And sometimes a scratch or a mark is actually part of that history. I don't necessarily want every watch I own to look like it spent its entire life sitting untouched in a safe, especially the watches I really care about. And part of that is because I expect that someday some of these watches will go to my kids. And when that happens, I don't necessarily want them to receive a perfectly pristine object. I'd rather they look at one of these watches and know that I actually wore it, that it went places with me. And some of those scratches were accumulated while I was doing the things I spent my life doing. They'll know the watch wasn't sitting in a safe, it was with me. So, tomorrow morning, bag is packed, I'm standing over the watch box with my stupid flashlight again, and for whatever reason, I'm only allowed to take one. I think I'm taking the Pelagos. And what's funny is that if you ask me which one I wanted on my wrist for the nastiest single part of the assignment, I probably might still say Marathon, but I'm not choosing this watch for just one moment. I'm choosing it for the entire trip. The Pelagos is light, it's incredibly capable, it has a refinement that we could actually see under the microscope. I can wear it into a dirty fire scene. I can wash it off, I can put on a decent shirt and wear it to dinner, and I just really like the thing. Sometimes that's the answer. We can measure everything. We can look at movements, we can compare materials, we can put watches under the microscope, we can make charts, but at some point, we're still choosing the watch that we just want to wear, gut feel, for the entire trip. I'm taking the Pelagos. But now I want to know what you would do. If these were your two choices, Pelagos or GSAR, which one are you taking? And actually, let's make it a little bit more broad than that. Forget these two watches for a second. You're standing over your own watch box tomorrow morning. You're going on a trip, and there might be some rough work involved. There's travel, there's dinner. You can bring only one watch. Which one are you grabbing from your own watch box? Tell me in the comments below, because I'm genuinely curious what everybody else's version of this decision looks like. If you've enjoyed looking at these watches from a slightly different perspective, I'd appreciate a like. And if watches, engineering, materials, failure analysis, and real-world testing sound interesting to you, please consider subscribing. Because I don't just want to talk about what manufacturers claim their watches can do. Whenever possible, I want to find a way to actually look at it, and measure it, and test it. I'm Paul Moore. Thanks for watching Watchsquisite, and I'll see you on the next one.